Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking one of the most extraordinary, bizarre, and honestly historically significant obsessions of the Middle Ages. Picture this. It's a time when the world map wasn't neatly drawn on your smartphone. It was mostly blank edges filled with shadows, rumors, and some pretty terrifying unknowns. And right in the middle of all that uncertainty, a myth is born. A myth that perfectly blended unshakable faith, profound desperation, and just wild fantasy. We are talking about the legend of Prester John.
It's kind of a wild thought, right? What if history's greatest king never actually existed? Today, we're unraveling a grand historical mystery. We're going to see how a completely fabricated savior, literally a phantom king conjured entirely out of thin air, somehow ended up redrawing the map of the world and totally altering the course of human history.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. A desperate medieval Europe. To truly grasp the sheer power of the Prester John myth, we first have to wrap our heads around the chaotic, terrifying world of the 12th century. This completely sets the stage for exactly why millions of people were absolutely desperate for a savior to ride over the horizon.
So the reality of life in 12th century Europe was, frankly, incredibly grim. The continent was locked in these brutal, exhausting power struggles with Islamic empires in the Middle East. The Crusades were raging, and Jerusalem, a city incredibly sacred to European Christians, was under constant existential threat. And hey, if you weren't dealing with foreign wars, you were definitely dealing with a devastating home front. We're talking widespread, agonizing famine, diseases wiping out entire villages overnight, and severe political turmoil tearing kingdoms apart from the inside. Life was just so fragile. It was precarious. Really, Europe was on its knees, practically begging the universe for someone, anyone, to tip the scales in their favor.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Letter of Paradise. Enter what we could accurately call the viral fake news of the Middle Ages. Suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, this extraordinary document pops up. It was a mysterious, highly detailed letter claiming to be penned by a mighty, unconquerable Eastern priest king who went by the name of Prester John.
Now, the claims in this letter were absolutely absurd, but to a desperate medieval audience, endlessly fascinating. Listen to this. Prester John wrote of his hidden paradise far to the east, boasting of crystal-clear rivers that literally flowed with gold, trees that naturally grew gemstones instead of fruit, and mythical creatures like unicorns and griffins just casually roaming his lands. But it wasn't just immense wealth. The letter claimed his citizens were immortal, that there were magical springs that cured any disease instantly, and that his entire kingdom was completely free from sin. And the kicker? This invincible king promised he was going to march his massive, unstoppable armies westward to help Europe defeat their enemies once and for all.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why the myth caught fire like it did. Just look at the stark contrast. On one hand, you have Europe's miserable reality, endless war, starvation, devastating plague, and political chaos. And on the other, Prester John's promised utopia, everlasting peace, infinite wealth, magical healing, immortality, and a mighty army coming to the rescue. When you put those two worlds side by side, it makes total sense why popes, powerful kings, and everyday commoners all bought into this fabricated dream. It was exactly what they desperately needed to hear.
Moving on to Section 3, Searching the Far East. What followed all of this was a massive historical wild goose chase. Think about it. What happens when an entire continent firmly believes a superhero is waiting for them in the East? Driven by this crazy cocktail of religious faith and sheer greed, explorers started setting out on incredibly dangerous journeys to find Prester John and secure that promised military alliance.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the timeline, and specifically the shifting goalposts. Obviously, Europe couldn't find him, right? But instead of giving up, they just kept moving their target across the map. Over 3 long centuries, this frantic search shifted from the mysterious lands of India in the 12th century, up into the vast, expanding Mongol Empire in the 13th, and finally all the way down into Ethiopia in the 14th century. They absolutely refused to let the dream die. One of the very earliest of these failed attempts was led by Bishop Otto of Freising. He pointed his expedition toward India, a place 12th century Europeans knew very little about, but naturally assumed was just packed with ancient magic and exotic wealth. Of course, after surviving harrowing travel conditions, the expedition found no magical priest king. The lands were vast and incredibly dangerous. But the wild thing is, when these explorers returned empty-handed, they didn't admit defeat. No way. To save face, they actually fueled the myth. They returned with outright lies and exaggerated tales about seeing golden rivers and mysterious glowing cities just over the horizon, effectively doubling down on the entire delusion.
Let's move to the 13th century and see how this builds, because this delusion only grew stronger. When Genghis Khan's rapidly expanding armies started conquering vast territories, Europe, completely blinded by the Prester John myth, totally misidentified them. Seriously, they expected Prester John's mighty Christian forces coming to save them. The reality? They were ruthless, non-Christian conquerors who had absolutely zero interest in a European alliance. Europe actually sent diplomatic missions bearing precious gifts, walking right up to these invading hordes, only to face an incredibly awkward and harsh reality check.
Okay, Section 4, the Ethiopian stronghold. Following that massive Mongol disappointment, we push into the 14th century, where the relentless search pivoted entirely away from Asia and aimed directly at the African continent, specifically at the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia.
So European emissaries finally make this grueling trek to Ethiopia, and honestly they were genuinely amazed by what they found. It was an ancient, deeply rooted Christian stronghold with these incredible rock-hewn churches and rich, complex traditions. But they quickly realized it was not the mythical utopia from the letter. There were no griffins flying around. People weren't immortal. It was a real kingdom facing real-world struggles, completely surrounded by hostile empires. And yet the sheer desperation to believe was so strong that the association just stuck. For centuries after this realization, European maps and minds stubbornly linked Ethiopia to the grand legend of Prester John.
Section 5, a myth-changing history. Let's zoom out now from the quirky, geographical wild goose chases and look at the macro takeaway of this explainer, because this is where it gets really important. We need to look at how this massive, centuries-long failure to find a fake king actually became a spectacular catalyst for the modern world.
So, the crucial point is the birth of the Age of Discovery. We often think of this era of extensive overseas exploration as being driven purely by cold, calculated science or the desire for new trade routes, right? But it was actually inadvertently kickstarted by generations of European explorers pushing across scorching deserts, dense jungles, and terrifying oceans, desperately searching for Prester John. Sure, he was entirely fabricated, but the search for him actually pushed the physical boundaries of the known world and permanently connected Europe to distant lands.
It really is an incredible journey from catalyst to legacy. Think about it. A simple, beautifully forged letter offering hope sparked these treacherous, impossible expeditions across mountains and jungles, which ultimately laid the very groundwork for the Age of Discovery. The powerful myth of a savior caused centuries of shifting and sometimes completely foolish diplomacy, but the real-world legacy was the forging of actual, permanent global connections between distant, isolated lands. It proves that even the most fantastical, seemingly impossible dreams can physically shape human history.
Which brings us to a final thought to leave you with today. In the bizarre, globe-spanning story of Prester John, the facts didn't forge the future. The fantasy did. So I have to ask you, when it comes to pushing the boundaries of human achievement, what matters more? The cold, hard truth or the incredible power of what we dare to believe? Thank you so much for diving into this fascinating chapter of history with me, and keep questioning the map.